Welcome back to Humans of Purpose, the weekly podcast featuring conversations with local, purpose-driven leaders. Leaders creating social impact through their work and fostering in a new era of social progress. We want you to listen, connect, and grow with us. Learn more at humansofpurpose.com.
Now, fortunately, because there are more companies doing it and really good solid examples of, that they intentionally set out to embark on creating a new product or service that had a really strong social element. And now we can start to see that even, that's it's being profitable and it's actually delivering on the social aspects of what it was designed to do.
Those were the insightful words of Helen Steele, CEO of the Shared Value Project. A short bit of housekeeping and we'll get right back to Helen. Firstly, my gratitude as always goes out to our listeners who have opted to actively support the podcast by becoming Patreon supporters. We are now 17 and getting closer each and every week to achieving our sustainability target of 30 supporters. So thank you to our Patreon supporter family, including Rich, Tanvir, Lucia, Judy, Jules, Sally, McCartan, Stuart, Joel, Misha x2, Bonnie, Olivia, Lyndon, Joe, B and Will. Our Patreon family really helped me to shape the direction of the podcast through their advice, ideas, referrals, and ongoing feedback. If you want to support the growth of Humans of Purpose, I encourage you to join our Patreon community. By supporting me to make Humans of Purpose, you're supporting independent local content production in the form of conversations about the things that matter most. To support us, just hit the link in our show notes or head to patreon.com/humansofpurpose. As mentioned, today I'm talking to Helen Steele, CEO of the Shared Value Project. Firstly, thank you to Charisse at the Shared Value Project, whose persistence made this podcast episode possible. It took me a while to open my mind to the positive impact that shared value can have in our community. Talking with Helen helps me to better understand the philosophy behind the movement and how it works in practice to promote positive social impact. We span some interesting topics in our conversation, including does altruism or intent to do good matter? And in the context specifically of corporate not-for-profit partnerships and corporate giving. We also discuss the benefits and challenges of cross-sectoral collaboration to tackle prescient issues of social disadvantage. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. So I am so glad you could make it. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks very much, Mike, for having me.
Well, I had the honour to meet the lovely Charisse last week for a coffee, and that definitely sealed the deal. So welcome. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, she was determined to get me here, so well done to her.
Well, it's always nice when somebody has heard about the podcast and likes it enough that they'll email you multiple times. So that's a winner.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a reflection on the success of the podcast for you.
You're too kind. Anyway, enough about me. I guess definitely here to learn more about you. So I would love to start with your journey into the space
sure.
to learn a bit more about the Shared Value Project.
Yeah. So I guess my background is multi-layered, like so many people's these days. I started my career in the corporate sector, in working for an IT company, and then I had the good fortune to go and live in the US, and I was there for many years, and really that's when I began really thinking about this intersection between business and society, and living in multiple cities. I started in Atlanta, Georgia, and then had a stint in Japan actually, and then to Boston. And when I was in Boston, I guess I made the decision to go back to school. I had Harvard down the road, so
not a bad place to be.
It really wasn't a bad place to be. And as it turns out, anybody who is foolish enough to pay full fees, that they'll pretty much take you on board. So I started I went and started through their summer school program actually, and was exploring international relations, and I'm sure for many of your listeners will be aware that in the US you're very much encouraged to do internships as part of your study, and as I said just before, this idea of business and society, it always really fascinated me, and I was fortunate to be able to get an internship with the United Nations Association. And I kind of laughed because I went back as a mature age student and laughed that I must have been the oldest intern that they ever had in my mid-30s. And but anyway, very fortunate that I landed there, and Lena Granberg was the executive director, and she just introduced me to, the NGO not-for-profit world and the work that the United Nations were doing, and just I guess, I really started to understand the mechanisms and the role that the NGO world played, and my role very much afforded me the opportunity. I mean, I was partnerships manager effectively, and yes. So shortly after I got the internship, they offered me a job, and really just got to learn so much about the process of engagement and really, as I said, for me, the partnerships role afforded me the opportunity to talk to corporations, talk to government. And, in the US, the corporate social responsibility sector is a very mature sector. I mean, and there are reasons for that, including tax incentives for companies to invest back into the communities. So it was a really mature corporate social responsibility experience. I was so fortunate to land at the United Nations Association and have such a fantastic introduction to that world and to see the importance of what they were doing. And I guess that really kind of fueled my interest in the not-for-profit world. And then I went on to run another organisation locally and started a branch of the American Australian Association in New England, and I guess that kind of was the beginning for me of my journey back to Australia. And again, had a fantastic CEO who I learnt so much from in that role, and then eventually, yes, I had the opportunity to come back to Australia and actually work for the City of Melbourne. So I've done the gamut of corporate, not-for-profit, and government.
I was going to say the multisectoral perspective is certainly there.
Yeah, it's interesting, and when I've spoken to my chair, Peter Yates, over the years about what's the skills and the talents that are going to be required for real collaboration to occur, as we affectionately refer to it as cross-dressing. You have the capacity when you've worked in multiple sectors to speak and understand, I think, the nuances and the language that each of those sectors have, and I think it's a real benefit and a great attribute for anybody working these days. And as so many have, I mean, I've had the chance to reinvent myself and through the different careers paths that I've pursued. But I guess when I came back to Australia, and in the role that I was playing at the City of Melbourne, it really afforded me the opportunity to actually look at the corporate social responsibility space and how business intersected with society here. And it was really a really different experience than I just had in the US. To me, it wasn't what I would call a mature
certainly not
sector or industry here.
It's funny when you're talking about language, and a lot of people use the language metaphor when they're talking about different sectors speaking different dialects or even different languages, but then different countries, you might be speaking in the same sectors, same languages, and it's different.
That's right.
In maturity and how it's perceived. So whereas we might think about corporate social responsibility here, when you say it now, people are thinking like, oh, maybe that's a little bit retrograde language to describe what's happening. But really, it's only been around and an actual thing here in very recent times.
Exactly. And when I came back, for me, what I saw was still sponsoring sporting events or things that didn't have any strategic alliance or strategic thinking behind it, and didn't really relate to what the purpose of the organisation was. So that's kind of what I saw. And I was working at the time at the City of Melbourne with Rod Ellis-Jones, who he and I founded the Shared Value Project together. And he originally showed me the article in, I guess, 2011 that Porter and Kramer had written. And I just thought it just made sense. It just made sense to me that, if we think that capitalism is the system we have, and how do we sort of more effectively pull the levers within capitalism, and the corporate sector is that lever.
Yep.
And also, I guess that what I sort of really saw was, and through my different experiences, that the corporate sector, that's where the resources lie.
For sure.
That's where the money is, a lot of knowledge. I'm not, and never do I suggest that the corporate sector, takes this leadership in trying to change the world and solve problems on their own, but they have a lot to contribute, much more than they probably have been contributing. And so the idea of shared value really resonated with me, and I just kind of thought, well, maybe this is something that could actually help companies sort of leap forward in their thinking around community engagement and community activity here. And so I guess that led to us eventually formalizing the Shared Value Project. And we kind of started back in the day with very informal discussions, but we quickly realized, I think, that leadership and CEOs were going to need to be involved in this conversation, not just CEOs, but the C-suite in general. And and so we were fortunate back then to be able to sort of tap into the network of PD Yates, who's now our chair, and start some of those discussions.
And how were those discussions received in the early days? Were they like, what planet are you on? Or was it sort of, did you have to change your language very much to meet at the same eye level? Or did you, what was your strategy there?
Yeah, I think that it was surprisingly, there was a lot of positive interest, which I don't think we necessarily anticipated. And if I think about the first round table that we had, we had a round table lunch, and I think at that table there was NAB, BHP, PwC, AIA, Australia, YMCA, and a couple of others, and I think that the sense that I felt then was that there was a genuine desire for companies to not conduct themselves, but have better community engagement. And I think they were struggling to work out how they could do it. I think there was a sort of a bit of a general sense that, what they were doing and what they were calling corporate social responsibility at that time wasn't really fulfilling their needs. It wasn't having the impact that they hoped it would, and how could they sort of do that better? So I guess we were surprised by that really positive response. And if you think about, even this was 2012, I think, when we held our first round table, and you think NAB was at that table then. Yep. So I guess I guess in looking at the conversations that have happened around the Royal Commission and others, I kind of, everybody gets disheartened by the behaviour of banks, but I guess I always feel good that, they knew back then that there was, that they needed to change the way that they were doing things. It wasn't working.
I think that the optics are certainly a problem in how we perceive the role of the big corporates. Because I think, Royal Commission's one thing, but people think in absolutes too much. You can be part of the problem, but also part of the solution in many ways.
That's right. And I think actually you've just hit on such a great point there, because if those companies who are part of the problem, that they have to be part of the solution. And anyway, it's interesting in some of the conversations we have with our not-for-profit members, and how there was a real reluctance to have a collective and a collaborative discussion with the corporate sector because of, those perceptions. But anyway.
But not-for-profits have also had to change very much how they think about also aligning with corporates. Because
Absolutely.
I think, as you said before, the days of, hey, let's just go and sponsor this team, when not-for-profits see corporates behaving that way or as such, they've got to think more strategically. So what is the shared opportunity here? And obviously the corporate wants to get something back, and it has to help the bottom line. No one's under any illusions about that. So the way that not-for-profits have become more sophisticated and how they work with corporate partnerships is quite amazing to me. Do you sort of share that?
Absolutely. And I think the purpose discussion that we're having now has been incredibly helpful in taking that conversation forward. I mean, corporations now, not just not-for-profits, are really trying to understand what their purpose is beyond their, fiscal obligations. So, and I think because of that and that shift that they're having, I think that there's now much more of a shared philosophy, I suppose. And I think that it will potentially shared philosophy with some of the NGOs and not-for-profits. And I think there'll be sort of more natural alignments that occur when each of them are seeking partners. So I think that's been a really kind of helpful discussion. And just going back to your earlier question about, so when we had our first round tables, there was a positive energy, but I think that, to be honest, everyone was still grappling with what the hell is shared value, and how was it going to take this conversation forward for us and elevate and think about, how we operate.
So maybe a good point to jump off then, and maybe we could have done this a bit earlier, but for the purposes of language and definition, that 2011 paper by Porter and Kramer is just foundational, not just in strategy, but in impact and, in every sense, in the boardroom and the executive table. How does that define shared value, and how do you sort of conceive of it today in your work?
Yeah. So, I think that for your listeners who don't know, so Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard, and along with Mark Kramer, and really the idea of shared value came from a lot of work that they were doing consulting to corporations, but they were consulting to their foundations, and they were tasked with how can we make our foundation be have great reach and be impactful. And I think that what they realized was, well, there was such a small amount of resource that was tied up in a foundation as compared to looking back at the core business. And so I think that they were really trying to work out how can we tap into all the knowledge, skills, assets that are sitting at the core of the business, and tap into those to actually try to get that impact that companies are looking for. So the idea for me that really resonates with shared value is it's actually not doing a kind of a traditional corporate social responsibility marketing exercise that makes the company look good and offsets, or even a traditional like philanthropic grant where you give an organization $10,000 or $100,000 and go off and do what you can. It's actually how can we as a business operate in a way and consider across the whole of how we operate what the societal impact or possibility is in terms of dealing with the issues that we as a business face. And I guess this is really the crux of the whole matter, is that businesses don't operate in a vacuum. They're impacted by the same social issues that we as individuals are. And so it kind of makes sense to me that companies would think about how they're best placed and the skills and knowledge that they have to actually address those issues that are actually impacting them and their capacity to conduct their business.
Yes.
I mean, it just kind of made sense to me. And so, shared value is about how does a business create economic value and social or environmental value at the same time, and doing it through their core operations rather than it being a peripheral activity.
Yeah, that's super interesting to me. So I think what I find really interesting about the shared value approach, because, with the whole challenge in 2011 or around that time of CSR, for whatever reason, stuff's not really happening here the way it needs to for things to change and to tackle all the issues we face. But then we've got all of a sudden, we've got B Corp, we've got corporate citizenship, we've got a whole bunch of maybe different tools, but trying to tackle the same problem.
Yeah.
The one thing that I find interesting about shared value is that it's about doing all of this, but in a really commercial context. So doing so in a way that is tied to making profit.
Yeah. And I guess, for me, it's how do you motivate a business? So you've got to talk in business language, which I think is what the shared value thinking is really, it has been really helpful in engaging business. It's because it is a business language. And so there's been cut through, and when you start to sort of talk to, the C-suite and say, well, you can actually do things differently, but still be profitable.
Yeah.
That's when things start to resonate. But you're right. There's been a plethora of different
associations,
complementary
membership groups. These types.
Membership groups, and just I guess complementary tools and products and things like you said, B Corp, conscious capitalism. So all of these, I guess, conversations have been really helpful in driving the conversation forward. And we don't see, impact investing is another really important discussion for us, because if you look at, if you go online and Google what the definition of impact investing is, it's basically the same as shared value in terms of the 100%. Outcomes.
I'd say it's the most commercially focused, or if you think about the language of economics and the sort of the tools and what's happening, I sort of place impact investing as sort of the most descriptive or prescriptive application of that kind of profit-driven language to solve social issues.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting one for me, as we've been pretty involved in the impact investing discussion, because not only do you need the business to conduct and operate in a particular way, you actually need the investors and the analysts and to understand and actually be investing in those companies that are changing their behavior. So we've and for me, I guess the slight challenge about the impact investing conversation, it is very often and targeted at small social enterprise type operations,
Yes.
whereas the whole reason for having the shared value conversation is because large companies have the capacity to take solutions to scale and quickly.
Sure. And I think scale is a key part of what you're saying there.
Yeah.
So obviously impact investing is driven by the ability to rapidly scale, which comes from venture capital. That's a very important core concept.
Yeah.
And I think where I used to struggle, or maybe still have a bit of tension around all of this, is just that focus on scale, commerciality and profit.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that are worth doing just because they're important.
I couldn't agree more, really. But I suppose for me, it's how do you work within this system,
Yep.
and you've got to think about what motivates our audience, and so then you've got to be able to have a relatable conversation.
Yep.
But I think that if we think about growth, I mean, current growth that we've experienced, and I'm talking about from a capitalist perspective over the last 20 years, is completely unsustainable. I mean, that's not what companies need to be thinking about. They need to be thinking about how can we just continue to, be sustainable in the real sense of that word. How do we just continue to adapt? Because the external climate, and I'm not talking about the sunshine, but we can get to that. But just there's so much, I guess, when you talk about externalities and things, I mean, they are core. I mean, they impact business. There's no question about it. And I think that companies need to be really thinking now about, in this kind of turbulent times, how do they just be resilient? How do they build resilience? How do they continue to serve the communities? And I guess part of my philosophy or my belief about business is most businesses were actually set up to serve society.
Originally, I would definitely agree with you.
Originally, and I mean, I can't think of a business that was set up to harm.
Yeah.
There's harmful activities that companies do in order to achieve, what they tried to set out. If you think about mining companies, you think, I don't think Philip Morris did establish themselves to kill people.
Debatable.
Well, I think if you go back to when they first started, they didn't. Banks didn't set up to screw customers either. So I think that the challenge, and we have this conversation internally.
Well, this is like the purpose of the corporation kind of conversation, isn't it?
Well, it kind of is, and I think that what's happened is that companies have got away from understanding why they exist.
Yeah.
They exist to serve the community, to serve customers, and it has been very much about that shareholder. Particularly the last 50 years, it's all been driven by shareholders, and it's not the whole story, and it's not, if companies, as I said, can't sustain their growth, it's just impossible. And so they need to actually go back to some old fashioned thinking.
Yeah, and I think it comes into sort of that conception as value being comprised of economic, social, and environmental has helped a lot.
Yeah,
because
that's right.
we don't think of it as a sort of zero sum game. It's not about just the balance sheet and the profit and loss. It's sort of thinking in that broader context. What are the costs that we haven't traditionally considered that that we're sort of taking on as a result of that rapid growth? And that's when I think about things like, we might be going really well and growing each year, but what is the state of our people?
That's right.
What is the state of our environment? What is the mental health of our workforce?
Exactly. And I think the Friedman, view of capitalism, I think we've moved. I think, well, if we haven't moved on, then we need to be moving on, because that's not what the next 50 years looks like, not from where I'm sitting anyway.
And obviously shared value can be a core part of making that shift. What else sort of comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, we've kind of touched on a lot of those things. I think the B Corp movement, I think the impact investing conversation, I think they've all been really helpful tools. And I see shared value as just one tool that companies can use.
Do you think that there are other levers, though, that we haven't touched on? So do you think, for example, about, ethical or purposeful leadership, political leadership? What else
politics.
has to happen?
Maybe we shouldn't touch politics. But, yeah, look, I think you're so right. I think just the way a company behaves, I mean, to be ethical in its behaviour and how it operates is fundamentally important. And I guess the benefits of that are not only that, the business is, the customer base, which we know customers, consumers are looking at companies and how they operate. And I do that myself, with decisions that I make about, my energy provider and even just consumer goods that I purchase now. I really think about that. And I know that it's not just the millennials. I'm not a millennial. I'm a little bit older, and I know it's not just their domain. I think about that as well.
It's everyone now.
It's everyone thinks about that. And so I think that is really fundamentally important. And I think that's really fundamentally important from an employee perspective as well. People want to work for companies that are doing good things.
But don't you think as well that it's like with people and how they're living their life? Yeah. Like if you talk to a fairly with it person who's, in tune with themselves, they're doing things like meditating. They're doing things like prioritizing exercise. They're watching their drinking. They're doing a whole range of things. And then you go to work. A lot of people just go to work, and where's all of that stuff? Yeah. It's sort of like there's this fundamental disjunct between where people are heading in terms of their own human needs, and what the workplace provides is another issue. Yeah,
and I think that's going to be dictated by the climate change environment conversation as well, in terms of human needs and what we really need. And but you're so right, and I think that what we don't want to trade off anymore. And I think that we talk about growth of businesses as not sustainable. Well, just the way we've been responding to that as, working our asses off and working ridiculous hours. And when I came back to Australia, and I thought, we used to live, we had a pretty relaxed lifestyle. But I think when I came back, I realized that and I remember reading a study or some stats on this, that we actually were working more hours than the US. I mean, on average. And I don't know about you, Mike, but I'm tired.
Everyone's tired and everyone's busy, and I think these are difficult things, because I think in some way, everyone has to say they're busy and tired, because it's sort of, if you don't, maybe you're not going great.
but I'm beginning to think quite differently about that personally.
But I do think though, it's a really bad thing, and it's bad because what it means is you can't be present with the people you love.
That's right. And just the way we consume is got to change, because it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the environment. It's not, it's not sustainable for our bank balances. Yeah. It's just all of those things. And I think that I think we need to go back to some simpler times.
I think a lot about things like that are frustrating in some ways, but also inspire hope, like the straws thing in the US. Like, the shift away from plastic straws to to metal straws, and here to basically, if you go anywhere for a takeaway coffee and you don't have a Keep cup or a Frank Green cup, you're going to get stoned publicly. You're a huge risk. That's changed.
Yeah, it has changed. I mean, I remember like visiting the Netherlands. 20, 30 years ago, and going to a supermarket, and they didn't have plastic bags then. I mean, that was a long time ago.
The plastic bags thing, of course.
It's there is the solutions are there, and I think this is kind of the interesting thing, and thinking about the the social enterprise piece and work that so many are doing. I think the solutions are there.
100%.
It's just how do we systemize? How do we regulate?
Using economics as well, which is, I think, something really positive that shared value brings to the table. So just little things like disincentivizing the behavior we don't like. So to pay 15 cents extra for a plastic bag wherever you are, people don't like that. They're going to do it less. Crazy. I mean, come on. So let's take that and then put it into as much that we can, or test and run trials on how else we can extend that logic to make it a better society.
Yeah, and I know, and I'm sitting here and I'm very privileged. So I've had access to great education. I've travelled. I live a pretty great life. So and I know that part of the argument is that not everybody has access to that, and so how do we bring the whole of society on the ride with us? And I think the work that not-for-profits are doing, But again, I still think that there's solutions there that are going to benefit ultimately everybody.
Well, I think a point I want to touch on is with the privilege. I also acknowledge my own privilege in this complex world we live in. But with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility to take action to try and reach as many people as possible with what's important. So we talked earlier about some of your why and why you do this work. And I share a similar why because change has to happen, and sharing these conversations that matter most with as many people as possible hopefully can help inspire some of that.
Yeah, and like you, I mean, I don't think the change is happening quickly enough. And if I think about what's going to impact, or what's going to have to happen in order for that change to happen quickly. Unfortunately, certainly here in Australia, we're probably seeing some of that playing out right now with the fires that are burning, and now all of a sudden there is attention on climate change and the impact that that's having on our society. And then I've been thinking about the knock-on effects to all of these fires and how it's going to impact agriculture and tourism but maybe out of this we can actually come up with new agricultural practices.
100. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope something positive comes out of what's a horrible situation. And I also find it quite troubling that it took a young girl with autism to become very upset on a global stage and to cry in putting your arguments across to get the global response that it did. In some ways, I'm very happy that it's had such a big response. Yeah. In other ways, I'm horrified that that's what it took for people to pay attention to a problem. And as you said, these kinds of disasters are happening locally and abroad that just make it harder and harder to live good and long lives.
Yeah. I have a 17-year-old daughter, and I've been saying to her for years, how is it that you're not angrier?
Love it.
So I mean, I think of not that I was alive during the protests of the 60s and the 70s, but the world then seemed to be angry and they wanted change.
You would have been right up in there in the 60s. Okay, I'm certain of it.
Maybe, I don't know.
You and I both. I would be next to you.
But I think we need to, and here in Australia, we have the capacity to express, our dissatisfaction with the way things are. So I think that demonstration and that collective voice is really required. Is it falling on deaf ears? I think that, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, some of these fires did impact some of our politicians, and so then I think we're going to get a different response, because I think it's when these things touch you that sometimes that you react accordingly.
I think politics has become inherently boring for a lot of people, disengaging.
Yep.
People have become more and more apathetic, and that's no surprise when you look at what's happened and the response and whatnot with the fires and each stage of life. But it does open up an interesting situation where the other stakeholders who have a lot of influence can do and are doing, and people are watching that with more interest, such as business. You've got this whole spectrum of things where it used to be the role of government. Now it's kind of shifted to business, not-for-profits, philanthropy. And what an exciting time, in a way, to be part of that space.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was interesting when I lived in the US. I mean, nobody went to government to solve problems. I mean, government didn't have any money. They're there to provide that regulatory, framework and support. But here in Australia, I think there had been and has been an expectation that government will, solve our problems. But I don't think that's the role of government. I think the role of government, they sit in an interesting space. They understand what the issues are. They can facilitate, I think, and bring together the parties that can actually really solve these problems. So I really kind of think that that's what they need to be doing more, is convening and then responding, from a policy and regulatory perspective. We'll see, how that progresses. But I think that that's the realization I've come to. There's no, I mean, this, in terms of how resources are allocated, there's no question that the business sector has the vast majority of resources. and can use the skills and the knowledge that the not-for-profit sector has in a really meaningful and engaged way. So it's how do we provide this environment where collaboration, which is talked about so much but really hard to do, but how can we create the environment where that collaboration actually happens so that we can work together on, to get those effective results and the impact the positive impact that we need.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think government has decided to sort of take the core systems coordinator, referee, steward role rather than being in the game, so to speak. So occasional funder of important works.
Yeah. And seed fund. I mean, they do seed a lot of programs, which I think is really, really valuable. As you work in the not-for-profit sector, so it's that seeding. But can we even shift that seeding and not just impact investing, but shared value investing?
Yep.
How do you actually invest in shared value opportunities? So that's kind of some of the conversations we're exploring.
That's exciting. Yeah. Let me play the role of the cynic, which I often play.
Good. Love a cynic.
It's a natural role for me. I can't help it. I blame my mum, but she'll she can't answer to that, so it's perfect forum. Does intention matter in this space? Because I think what I've been wondering a bit about is if shared value sort of has this conception that business wants to make a profit. One way it can make a profit is that it knows that it's profitable to invest in doing social good. So does it matter? It's sort of like an instrumental versus intentional kind of argument. If I just want to make profit and I can throw money at anything and I throw it at social, that's just one way of making money. Does it matter that my heart or my essential altruism isn't maybe as much in the game?
I think the intentionality is really important, actually, and I guess the member organisations that we work with, do want to actually intentionally from the beginning of these projects consider the social elements to whatever piece of work that they're undertaking, and so we actually sit down with them with a framework to actually help them map out. And I guess kind of co-design or like start the ideation of what it actually looks like to come from a shared value perspective as opposed to how they might have done things traditionally.
Yeah.
So I actually think that intention is key. And we're seeing a lot of companies now come out with their purpose statements, which is a great step forward.
Yeah.
But it's then how do they use the tools that are there and not just shared value, as I said, but, impact investing, B Corp, the B Corp audit to actually demonstrate and, that they're actually delivering on that purpose.
So matching up that expressed intention to do with the doing. Yeah. And I think, it's an excellent point. You kind of always worry as a cynic that people want to be perceived a certain way.
Yeah, sure.
Big hearts, we're here to save the planet, we're saving the world, and then it's easy to just say that, but what do you do next? How do you measure that?
Absolutely. And I guess and so it's heartening to me that there's a lot of companies are starting to do it, and then many more who are interested. And we're talking about big companies, and it takes a long time for them to change. But hopefully through some of the tools and the education programs and workshops that we run, they're certainly starting to get it. And it's really, I mean, how do you do it? How do you do it quickly enough? How do you continue to incentivize and inspire? So there's a lot of, the fluffy stuff kind of has to happen a little bit, but very much, and I've felt this from the beginning with shared value. Shared value is not a marketing, exercise. Yes, there may be, benefits and hopefully because the company or the business will be conducting itself in a way that's genuine and they're transparent about it. Well, that will hopefully be the knock-on effect will be that, customers will, be loyal and want to purchase their products, and they'll see that demonstrated through the work that they're doing. It's kind of acts, not ads, I suppose.
100%. And I think when you start to look at things like what actually happens when companies engage in practices that are the more stakeholder focused, the things that you sort of tend to see are employees that are happier.
That's right. And all of that links to corporate performance.
For sure.
And it's for us, I guess, it's how do you link these how do you link all these discussions to the corporate performance piece? Employee attraction and retention is just enormously beneficial.
It's the biggest thing, I would say, almost the biggest thing.
Absolutely. And one company who's among our members, and I don't like to, just bring up one as opposed to everyone else, but, I have to say that IAG, who's, I think Australia's largest general insurance company, what they've been able to do through their shared value work is really create a different culture within that organization, and now everybody wants to go and work for them, and that's starting to come through in I hope in their corporate performance and and maybe their share price. But so these sorts of some of the things that we want to start tracking to kind of be able to demonstrate that this is actually a really good thing for companies to do. It's not just a good thing, it's a profitable thing for them. And I guess one other thing I was just thinking about when we were talking about marketing, that even though, for us, we want more and more companies to kind of shift and think about shared value as their approach. I mean, I think corporate philanthropy and traditional CSR are actually still really important for businesses. I mean, that social license to operate.
Yep.
But we just don't want that to be an offset of bad, an offsetting bad behavior.
Oh, yeah.
So we want, I think an organization would still use all of those tools, including their traditional, corporate engagement, as a tool for them to conduct their business. And, and goodness knows, lots of organizations are still going to rely on just pure philanthropic funding. That they are still important. But we just trying to kind of, shift them and give them a new tool in their toolkit to have a more, hopefully impactful and better outcome for everyone.
And what sort of things do you have in place to make sure that the not-for-profit, as part of this sort of conversation, is not just a vehicle for more profit, but sort of a valued voice in the change process?
Yeah. It's really kind of been fascinating to engage with the not-for-profits and I don't want to be critical of them, but, as you mentioned, I think they have to change and transition and think differently about themselves. I mean,
sure.
They are businesses in their own right.
It's certainly true.
Most of them, they're all vying for, shrinking funding and I think that they need to actually understand what they do as a business and what value they actually bring. What are the assets that they can bring to this conversation? And then I think, and we talked about the language before, I think the challenge is sometimes, that many not-for-profits are used to having a grant funding or a sponsorship conversation.
Yeah.
They're not used to having a business conversation with these partners and actually thinking about what it is that they really bring to the table in terms of their own capability. So we've kind of been doing a lot of work in working with the not-for-profit partners of our corporate members to actually help them be able to, have a better, more meaningful dialogue and feel that they're more of an equal partner.
Yep. And
helping them understand what their skills, assets and capabilities as an organisation are. So that's kind of where we've sort of been, I hope having a positive impact.
Well, I think that's something you can certainly bring to the table. I think not-for-profits generally are also companies, and
that's right.
The way they have to operate in the space, that people have this misconception that not-for-profits don't have to make money. Of course they do. They have to. Of course they do. They've got enormous cost to cover usually in terms of staff, mainly, who are the service providers, and they, you show me a CEO who isn't expected to make a surplus every year, and I'll show you a CEO who's lost their job. Certainly, so
exactly.
There are expectations around performance that need to be communicated, but I think that hasn't always translated to not-for-profits having the best kind of acumen or language or presentation, and also knowing what corporates want from that kind of relationship. And
I think, there are many conversations going on now where, they are coming together more as equals. And I think certainly in the shared value space, having the not-for-profit partner involved in the ideation process of developing some of these programs, that's fundamentally important so that you can get the benefit of their understanding of it, whether it's a new market sector that a company's thinking about, but they really understand that landscape really well. And I think that's where you need them to be involved in the conversation is at the beginning.
For sure.
And then really, and each partner, the corporate and the not-for-profit, understanding what, how their values, and I'm talking about, I guess, personal values more so, actually align. Do they have shared philosophy? Are they, can they really work effectively and well together?
Where's that area of mutual interest and overlap?
That's right. And not just for a not-for-profit to come and think, oh, well, I'll go and have this conversation and it's going to end up in a big
I'll get
grant.
$100,000.
Yeah, I'll get $100,000.
Yeah.
Well,
not how the world works anymore.
It's just not how it works. And companies, and rightly so, as do not-for-profit organisations, they want return on investment.
For sure.
I mean, this is what is being demanded now. So you need to be able to respond accordingly.
Well, I think our boards demand it, corporate boards demand it. That's one thing we certainly have in common.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about cynic point number 2.
Oh, yeah.
So read your lovely article in Pro Bono earlier, and you mentioned purpose washing, which is one of my biggest ires. And, that and impact washing, I'd say. Greenwashing. Any kind of washing where you've got that kind of that thorny divide between how something's pitched and what it actually is. Yeah. And, you go online today and you type in something like impact or purpose, and everyone's a chief purpose officer or a chief impact officer, or, having huge impact, have more impact. How do you tackle this problem, I guess, is my question. How do you think about that problem? And in your context especially, maybe how do you kind of be quite careful that, you don't have people or companies out there playing that kind of shared value card or that purpose card without properly doing the work? Yeah,
I mean, we're not the moral police, and nor are we the shared value police. But so my view is, if companies are starting to hire purpose, chief purpose officers, look, I think that's only helpful, actually, ultimately. But I think going back to, what we just talked about, intention, I think that it goes back to what a company's intention is. But having said that, even, when we first started, so we formally started the Shared Value Project as a member-based organisation in 2014, and most companies, they didn't know what shared value was, and so you kind of have to start somewhere.
Yes.
And we had the benefit because we'd had a couple of years of informal dialogue with NAB, AIA, IAG, and a few others. I mean, they did come on board relatively early as members because they intentionally wanted to change and explore what this meant. But the examples we had back then weren't great. And that's what everyone wants. The evidence.
You need to build
piece.
The case studies.
So you kind of you've got to build the case studies, and so now, fortunately, because there are more companies doing it, and really good solid examples of that they intentionally set out to embark on creating a new product and service that had a really strong social element, and now we can start to see that even. That's it's being profitable and it's actually delivering on the social aspects of what it was designed to do. But that takes time.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess we haven't beaten people over the head about it. We're quite careful, I suppose. In terms of the that best practice that we're starting to put up and those case studies, and making sure that they are as we see it, putting a pretty strong shared value framework and lens over it to make sure that we can go hand on heart. This is they intended for these outcomes, but again, because I guess one of the challenges of shared value is it's longer term outcomes. It's longer term thinking.
It takes time to.
It takes time. So we've been in existence as a member based organisation for 6 years.
Yep.
I mean, the concept has been around since 2011. So I'm hopeful, and what gets me excited is that there are more and more companies talking about it. Can we help them talking about it in a better way? Yes, and that's what we try to do. And you can be cynical but I guess I just choose to be positive rather than cynical.
I think the other thing is, with any kind of new thing that you're trying to create change, and systems change is hard to do.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a certain period of time by which you talk about that change before it's happening, and then it starts to happen, and then you can talk with more confidence, and then it's it's that sort of talking doing cycle that tends to level out. And then you get the case studies, and then you're talking about things that have happened, and it's far more credible.
Yeah.
But I think you're totally right. I mean, that really is the cynic voice in my head. But you have to see the good that's come from all of that.
That's right, and baby steps.
Yeah.
But I guess what's interesting right now is that you do have a lot more influencers understanding what the possibilities of this are,
and
and you've got. if I think of the US Business Roundtable that came out with their statement last year, and you've got Larry Fink with his new letter, and I guess the commitment that BlackRock has made in terms of not investing in fossil fuels any longer, or certainly coal. That yes,
football clubs divesting from gambling, I think, is an interesting one.
That's right.
I wish mine would.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that what I feel hopeful about is that, there's big influencers now talking about this, and I think that will make a huge difference to, I think hopefully it will speed up.
Well, I think today actually what's interesting is that talk is far more accountability based than it used to be.
Yes.
When you say stuff as a public figure of a company or a not-for-profit, philanthropy, whatever, when you're on record as saying you're going to do something or you're making a big statement, people expect you to kind of live up to what you've said and do that.
That's right. Well, they're being held much more accountable, and that transparency piece is becoming vitally important. And for us as an organisation, and we have these moral discussions internally about what organisation wouldn't we talk to? Well, I'd like to think we'd talk to everybody. I think that every company, whether it is even the Philip Morrises of the world, could benefit from
I'll see if I've got any Philip Morris execs on my LinkedIn. I doubt it. I'll double check.
We have been having. They have reached out to us over at different times over the years.
Yep.
When I had the great privilege of going and doing the Harvard Business School executive program on shared value with Michael Porter, the great Michael Porter. It was a bit scary.
I wouldn't have been able to hold it together.
It was kind of. I tried to hide in the room so he wouldn't ask me any questions. But I was actually sitting next to a woman from Philip Morris when I did that course.
That's incredible. That's very inspiring. Philip Morris is inherently depressing, but that is inspiring.
Yeah. Well, I think it demonstrates that business, it's not sustainable as a business. You can't kill people and expect to retain customers. It can't be your main business model. So I guess these little things, I'm hopeful that they, are thinking differently.
Well, I think your pragmatism is very enjoyable and refreshing, because I think there's a lot of people who like to kind of virtue signal and signpost around this kind of stuff, and they say, "Oh, look, I'd never work for a big bank. They're just shocking. The mining company is just shocking. They're destroying the planet." They might be, but they're very powerful. They're very big. They have a lot of resources. And do you want to be a good actor in a really challenging environment, or do you want to not be part of any change at all? Because those are your choices.
And then as consumers, we also need to take some responsibility, because they're out there mining, gold for my iPhone. So it's kind of and I think this is, we're always very quick to blame companies, but as consumers, we also need to take some of that responsibility.
I think we all kind of have this idea of who we want to be, and we all fall somewhat short, etc. But I heard a podcast the other day saying that Leonardo DiCaprio has been very active in this climate change space, and he's called out as still using a private jet to fly everywhere. It's just funny little stuff like this comes up.
It is. But, for me personally, I try. I still have a problem with shoes, I'll have to confess. But,
you don't like them, or?
And I like them too much. But, as a consumer, I am thinking much more consciously about the everyday decisions that I make. And, I think about the environment and the impact that I had. In fact, I kind of laugh. My 17-year-old daughter, Amelia, I'm naming her now, she did an environmental audit of an audit of my environmental household practices, or our household practices. And according to her, I didn't do very well.
But you told me she doesn't care about stuff, and here she is doing an
audit.
No.
She cares about stuff enormously.
Just some stuff.
Yeah. No, it was being angry. I wanted her to be angry. It was being angry. She cares deeply,
she
actually.
Cares, but not to the point of anger, which is an issue.
Yeah, so I need, and having said that, in her defence, she actually did go and participate in some of the climate change demonstrations. So I was very, very proud of her. I'm, trying to make her be an activist, but she's a very shy activist.
Yep, that's okay. There's room for reserved activists too.
There is. But anyway, it was kind of interesting for her to do that, and for me now, God, I can never peel the cling wrap off the roll anymore. I have to use the bee, the other sort of bee, the bee, and all of those sorts of things. But it's really good for me to think about that, and personally, I'm really interested in the circular economy piece and waste management and how we can actually create circular systems.
Do you think you could get Amelia to come here and do a environmental practices audit?
Oh, look, I'm sure she'd love to. I'm sure I can bring her over and have her do that.
I'm quietly not very. No, we're doing well. What I think is funny is like old mate Cyril over there eats a dog food, which 50% of the profits save a life. The 50% of the revenue or whatever goes into helping other dogs. So Cyril's actually a social justice warrior.
But how is that dog food being manufactured?
Oh God! Don't take me there, Helen.
And I will say my house is a lot smaller than yours, so I'm feeling a bit superior from that perspective.
I tried to get solar panels, and we're facing the wrong direction. Is that so? What would Amelia say about that? I tried.
Well, surely you can get them on some sort of louvered system.
You're right. I'm not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for dropping in and for sharing your wisdom, experience, and good banter with me today.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. Really appreciate it.
How can people learn more about your work at Shared Value and connect with you if they want to?
Yeah,
and you want to?
Well, I'd be very remiss if I didn't direct people to our website in the first instance. So sharedvalue.org.au, and there's certainly lots of other conversations and things that are happening in the world. So I guess pay attention. And capitalism for what it's worth. I suppose it is a system we have, and
it's like democracy. Yeah, it's not great, but it's the best we've got.
It's the best we've got. I mean, I've looked at other systems. I mean, communism socialism. They've all got pluses and minuses that we could spend a lot of time arguing. But for me, it's how do we kind of leverage the system we have and work within that system, and that's what I choose to do. And
on a more practical level, if people want to connect with you,
sure.
You're on LinkedIn and whatnot, and
LinkedIn. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent.
No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, no, LinkedIn. Please check me out on LinkedIn, and I think my email address is up there as well. So hsteele@sharedvalue.org.au.
Awesome. I'm sure people want to further that conversation, even potentially the political one, which is quite an interesting way to end.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you hit the subscribe button in your podcast player or the link in today's episode notes. Why not share the podcast with your networks? After all, 62% of our subscribers come from word-of-mouth recommendations and social shares. You could also leave us a 5-star review and some kind words in the iTunes store. If you love what we do each week and want to support the show, you should join our growing community of Patreon supporters or consider becoming a show sponsor. To learn more about all of that, just head to humansofpurpose.com.